we've all tried chasing happiness. And as someone who struggled with a lustful spirit, it doesn't really happen through any of the metrics in which people usually aim at it happening, such as when I get the career, when I get the education, when I get that person, when I have this much money, when I have this house. And that's a lot based on how our culture is very individualistic. And so I think that stepping up to the adventure of life is to create purpose and meaning. And to create purpose and meaning is going to actually look something that resembles happiness. Your life isn't Mai Tais on the beach. Your life is the hard conversations day to day. Your life is the responsibilities and duties that you have to fulfill in the roles that you fill in your life.
Are you feeling a little bit overwhelmed with all the external pressures and expectations that the new year brings? Maybe you're feeling a little bit stuck in your current situation or feeling anxiety about falling behind. The good news is you are not alone. So many others, myself included, are feeling the exact same way. The further good news is therapy can help. A therapist can help you distinguish external pressures from your own internal values. Develop a timeline that feels authentic to you rather than one imposed by society. Process any feelings of inadequacy or comparison and whatever else you might be feeling or experiencing. Whatever challenges this new year might bring up for you, BetterHelp, who is sponsoring today's episode, can help make it easier. BetterHelp is a therapy platform that is entirely online, making it both comfortable and convenient. Simply fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. And don't worry, you can easily switch therapists at any time if it's not the right fit. Start fresh at any day of the year with BetterHelp by clicking the link in the show notes or go to betterhelp.com/unfulfilled to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today I'm joined by a fantastic guest, Dylan Phaneuf. He's a fitness and mindset coach, and he's focusing on helping you build stronger bodies, but also sharper minds. Dylan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for joining me today. So let's dive right in. You talk about this idea that happiness is not the thing that we should be chasing. What should we be focusing on instead?
Purpose and meaning.
What does that mean?
If we think about, a lot of the great philosophers, if we think about a lot of the biblical texts and just what I've been able to shape from living a life and coaching people, I think happiness is very fleeting. And there's no evidence that suggests that that is the proper aim of a human being, to provide a rewarding and purposeful life. Purpose and meaning is the boat that will keep you afloat during the storms of life. And if you don't have that, it's going to be really easy to just be blown off course and feel like you're defending against life with your eyes closed, waiting to get through the storms. And I don't think it's if the storms are coming, it's when. And so I would rather aim at building something that can build me the arc through that. And that seems to be a message that people are very hopeful to hear, because I think we've all tried chasing happiness. And as someone who struggled with a lustful spirit, it doesn't really happen through any of the metrics in which people usually aim at it happening, such as when I get the career, when I get the education, when I get that person, when I have this much money, when I have this house. And that's a lot based on how our culture is very individualistic. And so I think that stepping up to the adventure of life is to create purpose and meaning. And to create purpose and meaning is going to actually look something that resembles happiness. Your life isn't Mai Tais on the beach. Your life is the hard conversations day to day. Your life is the responsibilities and duties that you have to fulfill in the roles that you fill in your life.
That was really beautiful. And I couldn't agree more. It's something that I like to talk about a lot, which is why I wanted to make this our first topic of conversation. It is really hard to chase happiness, and that thing that we think is going to make us happy isn't ultimately going to make us happy. But I think a lot of us learn that when we actually get that thing and then we realize, oh, wait, I don't feel that sense of happiness I thought I would. And I think society feeds us this message that we will. And so it is really difficult, unless you're told otherwise, to actually believe that those things aren't going to make you happy. Do you know the two terms, Eudaimonic and Hedonic happiness? Eudaimonic and Hedonic. I love that idea that, okay, maybe the purpose and meaning is that eudaimonic happiness, that deeper sense of happiness that we should actually be striving for, rather than those those more surface level pleasures, like you said, Mai Tais on the beach, or those hedonic happiness sources of pleasures.
Yeah, and the hedonic type is mostly what we've used to try in culture to try and garner this quote unquote happiness. And the other piece that you mentioned, the Eudaimonic, is what we are seeking for. And you can see that the way that people will attach faith to ideologies, people, places, and things, because this spirit is in lack. There's holes in the heart that are trying to be filled that I don't think we can fill in the methods that we're trying to do it. And I have my ideologies of why that is. And it's always existed to some extent, but I think it's in Western cultures a difficult time right now because we've walked away from a lot of the principles that have built the societies that we stand on. And God willing, I think there's going to be some change actually in the next, 5 years to even that out, because all pendulums do eventually swing.
Like we've strayed too far, so something's going to pull us back.
Yes. And unfortunately, I think we're in the season where it's probably going to go too far the other way, because we've allowed sort of this push to one side too far. And that's kind of like, and especially I'm Canadian, so I have no skin in the game, but what's happening in because you're from the US, right? You live in New York.
Yes.
Especially in New York. You guys had let the pendulum swing so far one way, and now it's probably going to swing back the other way. So you have this ultimate doji team like cleaning things up, and just whether you think that's right or wrong, it's doing a bunch of different things than what's been done. And that's essentially how pendulums always work throughout history. Any culture, any civilization has seen the same trends. We're not living in a new timeline. We didn't invent human psychology.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What do you mean swing too far the other way?
So like a lot of people right now in your guys, and I'm just interested in culture and people. I've always been very interested in psychology and what makes people do what they do. So I'm a little bit interested in the political landscape, not for the politics itself, but because the people influence things, and
Sure.
I like to watch what they're up to. And, like the whole RFK movement and things like that, like he's probably going to knock some things down that I don't think need to be knocked down. But that's because when there's walls and secretism and everything is hidden behind that, the pendulum's going to go too far, right? So it was like everything's tolerated. And that's what we kind of had became in a culture, is everything is tolerated. And the thing is love is not totally tolerable, right? Like if I really love someone, that might mean telling them like, no, you're not doing that thing. I might love my children, but I'm not letting them to go play out on the highway. Right. Mm-hmm. And especially a fatherly love, which is a leadership role love. And that's what you're starting to see come back into play. And when people are not used to it, it doesn't feel like love.
That's really beautiful. That is really interesting. It's almost like enabling. So let's come back to this idea of purpose and meaning, because I very much agree. I think purpose and meaning is that pursuit that we should be focused on. What's your advice for someone who may not know what their purpose or deeper meaning in life is to perhaps find it?
Luck won't strike the idle. And so it's very difficult to cultivate purpose and meaning from a place of despair. Faith is sort of the antidote to fear, and gratitude is the antidote to anxiety in some sense, because you can't be anxious while you're gracious. And it's very hard to live in fear while having massive amounts of faith. And so those two antidotes are usually the thing that you need to work in your life before purpose and meaning will appear. Because our brain is essentially a system of letting in the information and answering the questions that you've programmed to ask it. And so as an example, if you ask, why is it that I always have to work this hard to make this little income, etc., your brain is going to find answers to that question. And so you start to live self-fulfilling prophecies. And until you can kind of put your head up and shoulders back and clean up your life at the most basic level, it's going to be very hard to find meaning and purpose. And I say all that to say, after working with hundreds of people over 12 years of kind of doing what I do professionally, I've boiled down, most people have the same 5 problems. Most women have a very similar character arc in their life, and most men have a very similar character arc in their life. We have very different pasts and very different kind of stories that weave together, and we're all standing in different places at different times and with different people and different problems. But the underlying psychological sort of layering of that is basically the same for every person. And so once you find out what 5 to 6 levers move 80% of the needles, you can sort of apply that to a lot of folks' lives. And again, I think a lot of people are asking, like, how do I get purpose and meaning? Because they're looking for the immediate gratification of becoming happy. And the thing is happiness is going to be a lot more delayed, and it's probably going to be a lot less glorified. And it's going to be moments that you appreciate when they're there. But the struggle is what we all tell the story about. No one writes a movie about a perfectly flat line, right? It's almost like a large pulse from a flat line to a spiking pulse and everything in between. And that's why we see the world through a story. We can't see the world any other way. And I think that the culture right now has become really in tune with trying to see the world through a set of facts. And that's where science and philosophy need to come back together, because they've separated for too long. And that was never the way that they were incepted. Art, philosophy, religion, and science were in unison. And we've broken those out and really want to take this scientific experiment where we haven't looked at, we're really unwilling to look at what we see with our eyes and believe. It's really a strange place to be, to me, as someone who feel like he grew up in the 1600s, but it's interesting to be a part of the experiment.
That was really beautifully put. And I couldn't agree more. I think it's coming back to faith, coming back to gratitude, and focusing less on that instant pleasure, that instant gratification. But again, our society is feeding us that message that that's what we should be receiving. And one topic I do want to dive into with you is the importance of focusing on patience rather than rushing for those instant results. But you did mention these 5 traits in most human beings, and I would love for you to share what those are.
Sure. And so sort of the traits almost, because I like to look at, I'm very good at understanding inputs and outputs. Mm-hmm. And as someone who, and I don't say this to say anything other than to hope to create understanding. I have a very high level of EQ. So I've always been able to feel what people are feeling, and that comes at a detriment, but a blessing as well. If you've learned to weaponize it the way that I have and created a career that I help people. And so most people are stuck at very similar levels in the game. And there's kind of a growing period between 20 and 30, between 30 and 35, 35 and 40, and 50 to 60. And when you understand the underlying behaviors in which people are going to need to look at to grow successfully into those phases, they're pretty much all the same. And so some of those things might be the inner child work. So let's find where we're stuck, because a lot of people think that they know how to think, and they don't. Because thinking is essentially asking yourself a series of questions, and what is your internal voice stating to you? And most people have the internal voice of an internal tyrant. It's usually like they're working for some evil tyrannical king, and they're either never living up or trying to over-deliver and seek something. And usually we're trying to fill our lacks. In our 20s and 30s, we're trying so hard to create a story that is the opposite of what we've seen. Most young women and most young men's ultimate dream is to not repeat the same mistakes or create the same hurts that we've been subjected to. And in that weird obsession ends up coming a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're almost guaranteed to do that. And so I try and help people open up to, looking inside and becoming very aware and starting to ask better questions of themselves. And I would say that is an example of one of 5 levers, that if I can create a new level of self-awareness with someone so they ask themselves different questions, the world will start to open itself up to them in a different way. Because how you've programmed your brain designates what your eyes let in through your fovea, which is going to influence how you see the world, right? And that's sort of this idea, if you boil it down to a simple maxim, and we've all heard this, and it's annoying to hear because we all know it's true, but it's sort of annoying because it feels impossible, which is life is 90% what you do about what happens to you and 10% about what happens to you. Mm-hmm. That's kind of this idea on scale. But I work with people in their everyday decision-making to show them that they're actually usually have that equation flipped. They're reacting to life, and they're in a constant state of fight or flight and just reacting to the things that are coming at them. And it's very hard to orient yourself forward, to come back to the original point, and find purpose and meaning without all of these pulled. And I don't know if we have time to get into like how I've boiled down my entire coaching philosophy and how it would help
Part
someone.
two.
Yeah, and it would almost need to be like specific context because, like I said, everyone has a different story arc. So there is sort of overlapping principles that I'm looking for. But as someone with great communication skills, how I display that information and how I ask them the questions to get curious about becoming aware is so different person to person.
I think there's so much truth in that. In our thoughts become things, right? It may be another way to frame that maxim that you shared previously. What we focus on really does determine our reality and our perspective and how we feel. And it's a truth that I've especially felt in these last few years. I'm only 26 on this growth journey. I love that you do that work with people to reframe your mindset because at the end of the day, your mindset is everything, but it's also the hardest thing to train. And it does take daily training to constantly channel those positive thoughts rather than resorting to those fight or flight, reactive, negative thought patterns. Let's talk about this idea that searching for that instant gratification, that instant pleasure, is not what we should be focusing on, and the importance of focusing on precision and detail in whatever it is we're striving for. Can you share a little bit about this?
So I think that precision and detail are very important theories because most people, again, and I reference the idea of kind of being on the defense and waiting for life to attack us. And we're really good at defending from life and kind of closing our eyes to the storm. How I try and help people, if I was to use kind of 3 easy maxims that are teachable in a short timeline where people can really have, because we could talk philosophy all day, but I like to share pragmatic things that are going to be useful for the everyday person who's like got kids, they're on the go, they're, downtown New York City, a crazy person who wants to live there like you. The first step that I need to do is I need to adjust the standards because what you have is your musts, right? And so I try to get people to change from could, would, or should into must. And that's this idea that you just spoke about of like how you see the world and what you think will attract kind of what you're gravitated to and what comes to you. And that's very much the case. People don't like to hear this, but most of what we have in our life is sort of the equation of what we think and what we know, and at least what we act out, which what you act out is what you believe. I don't watch for what people tell me they believe. Right. So as an easy example, you get in your car or a car, maybe you don't have one in New York City, and you get in your car and you put a seatbelt on because you believe that it's more likely that in the event of an accident, you would be better off. And so you use the energy to put the seatbelt in. Right. And a lot of people tell me that they're doing their best. And I know this is something that you wanted to talk about, but raising that standard. And so just setting the standard, like for me now, as someone who's lost 150 pounds from once upon a time,
Wow.
I had the standard of my life. My body was a manifestation of the standard of what I was willing to put into my body, into my mouth, and how often and how much I was going to do that. And as soon as I changed the standard for that, that part of my life changed, which sent a ripple effect into everything else. So the first thing is the standard. The second thing is the story. Because what you're acting out is what you believe to be true. And so I kind of tried to tie into this as well. I need to change the story because most of what people are is walking self-limiting belief systems. And so if I can remove a lot of those and help identify why those self-limiting beliefs might be there, you'd be surprised how fast people can accelerate once they've removed these stories. And usually these stories feel like they're a worldly story, like everyone's thinks this about you and you think this about you, when in reality we're very porous. We're like concrete. We actually absorb things, especially slowly over time, and usually they're the influence of 1 or 2 people that have said or done something to us, and now we've embodied that identity. That's why we're very sensitive to community, and that's why they also say, as a simple maxim, you'll most likely be the same as the circle that you hang around with, and that can be good or bad, right? Because we're very porous. So changing the story, the internal story, because I know we see the world as a story. So if you see yourself as someone who can pull themselves out of poverty, as someone who can overcome school or whatever challenges people are facing in their life, they'll start to act differently and move differently. And some of that is because they're willing to enact delayed gratification. The third thing is the strategy. And so standards, the story, and the strategy. Because a lot of people, and let's just take my work, because I think a lot of people will understand this, as a coach who helps people with their mindset, and particularly a lot inside of their fitness and nutrition, most people already know what not to do. And so they have a philosophy on what they already should be doing that's probably more useful than what they are doing. But they haven't been able to enact those facts out in the world into a story. And that ties back to what I was talking about earlier, where we've boiled the world down to a set of facts. And so a lot of people know that they should just eat less calories, but they haven't figured out how to change the story that they're living out based on all the context and factors of their life. And so it's very annoying to know something and to not act it out. If you want to talk about a state of human negative emotion, it's having all the potential in the world and putting yourself in a self-imposed prison psychologically. That's the most terrifying place to be for most people. And unfortunately, a lot of people are there. And so I've studied the earth. I've studied all the greatest thinkers, athletes, and psychological literature. I'm very obsessive about this. And I think that we've also created a culture where people think it takes 20 years to change things. And I was one of these people that, well, that's just how I am. And one day, I'll do my therapy or I'll do this. And now when I work with people, it's like, no, in 6 months, I want to see their life radically changed. And I believe that can happen. And maybe I'm naive to that, but it's what I've seen happen. And so I'll keep acting that out.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, thoughts become things. So if that's your thought that you're going to continue to focus on every day, that's your goal, that's your mission that you're working towards, it will happen. Versus where you have that timeline of, oh, maybe in 20 years, that will be the outcome and result. I think
Right.
that has a huge, huge impact. I love that you brought up the idea of delayed gratification. I did a whole episode on this recently. It's one of my favorite topics. And I know it's just huge in the self-improvement space because delayed gratification is required and necessary to achieve anything good. It's important to focus on delayed gratification, knowing that on the other side of delaying that instant gratification are the bigger wins, is that Eudaimonic sense of happiness, that deeper meaning and purpose. There's no finding that deeper meaning and purpose without also coupling it with delaying gratification. Curious your thoughts. I think that's what holds a lot of people back from going after things that they know they should, because they would rather succumb to those instant pleasures or instant gratification.
Yeah, it's almost, in my opinion, it's become sort of like an epidemic because we've dopamined everything. And, I like a lot of the parts of that fast moving world. So I can't even necessarily say that I don't partake in it in my own ways. But if we're not careful, it's really easy to get stuck in that trap of just trying to have that individualistic mindset every day. We do only get one life, but our main goal is to reproduce as human beings. We still are a biological species, whether we want to admit it or not. And I think when you take on life as if your happiness is the most important thing of the aim of your life, probably going to end up being the opposite, to be honest, because it's hard to serve when your immediate desires are at the forefront of your decision making. And I know that to be true as someone in it, and this will sneak up on anyone anywhere in their life. I was making multiple 5 figures a month and feeling very unhappy, right? And so that's not defined by any one point of success. And that's because I wasn't living a life of servitude. And I'm trying to figure out how to do that. It's very difficult to deprogram that sense of individualism, that we all carry. And if you can start to serve in community and serve in family and serve in faith, I think that recipe is a lot more likely to produce, again, whatever quote unquote happiness is exactly.
Yeah, no, you just gave me chills. I couldn't agree more. And similar to you, I love hearing stories of historians or successful people who have already learned these lessons and have carved the path for us, because they say it constantly. They say, no, happiness isn't in the wealth or in these goals and metrics that we reach. They can add to our lives, but they're not going to give us that deeper sense of happiness and purpose and meaning that we're looking for. One of my favorite podcasters, Chris Williams, says this. He says there's certain unteachable lessons that sometimes we just have to figure out on our own. So as you just mentioned, you had to make all the money to realize, oh, that actually isn't that deeper sense of meaning and fulfillment that I am looking for.
Yeah, and Chris essentially boiled those unteachable lessons maxims down from a few people. First, Aristotle, and then secondly, Alain de Botton, who's a very well-known psychologist, as well as he's the founder of the School of Life. And I think everybody struggles with this, but especially men. I'm going to be honest with you. There's a certain portion of men that are born with this conquering fire inside of them. And a lot of that, if you look at the most successful people, they have a lot of the same three common traits, which is a superiority complex, which is usually designed internally to survive very difficult things, because you had to believe that you were meant for more to survive the life that you were undergoing. And usually that stems from early childhood trauma of a variety of sources, physical or mental. The second thing is this constant seek for validation. And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where you'll usually seek what you lacked. And so I didn't realize that my whole 20s was a giant game of building a validation machine from everywhere, and things that I wouldn't have, even if myself now would have pointed that out, I wouldn't have even seen it then, because I didn't have the wisdom to see what I see now. And so, 10 years ago, you're just chasing all these forms of validity. And let's say like building a social media following, that would have been a really easy, subtle one, or one that stood out. You could see that. Like I would have understood like, oh, there's probably some validity in that chase in building a social following. But there can also be validity in the stories that we tell ourselves, right? So who are we seeking validation from and why? And that's an example of a position switch that can prevent people from one of these unteachable lesson paths, as you so well stated. But unfortunately, most of us are going to have to feel stuff before. And I'm that way. I've learned this a long time ago. I've said for a long time that the Lord makes me learn the hardest lessons, because I'm one of those people that even if I watch everyone get stung by the electric fence, I have to go over there and see how hard it's going to sting me. But you learn a lot of lessons, and it's made for a good career path for me, because I really can tell when people are straying the path, because I've strayed every path that there is.
And you know what? I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of life is learning the lessons as we go. I think it's what makes life so colorful and deep. There are going to be moments that feel difficult because that's one of the most important lessons that you need to learn. And I don't think there's a life where you can avoid that. I think no matter how much you try to learn from other people's mistakes and how much research you do and how careful you are, life's always going to throw difficult lessons at you. But I think on the other side of those lessons is a deeper sense of growth and a more fulfilling life, because it was a lesson that you needed to learn. So it's really easy to get really into, self-improvement and wanting to be productive and having tunnel vision on your goals. And you've spoken to how it's easy to self-isolate when you get in this place and perhaps turn away community and connection. But can you speak to the importance of community and connection and how to find that balance?
I can speak to probably what not to do more than what to do. Something I'm learning in real time. And, I'm very blessed that I have a wonderful kind of business community who are made up of people that I call my brothers, that I would take a bullet for. And I'm very blessed to have a church community. I'm very blessed to have a spiritual father and people that care about me in my life. And I've done the isolation thing so much. And in creating some of these new things that are new to me and still feel very foreign, if I'm being honest. And sometimes I feel like I'm not worthy of, if you just want to get real. And so it's really easy to reject the idea of those things because of self kind of fulfilling prophecy and poor internal story, right? But some stories are worked very deep and they're very old. Some stories last the test of time. And so it's hard to retool some of these stories. Like I said, I'm very blessed to have great community around me. But when I'm suffering internally, some of my trauma is still to isolate myself to protect the people I care about in these communities from me. Because one of the things that I developed a habit of is seeing the world through a story where love is only accessible through excellence, achievement, and accomplishment. And so anything that's creating problems or anything that isn't sort of perfect, there will be no love for that. And so when I'm in a community, when I'm feeling loved as someone who is a little bit more manic by trait and has admittedly struggled with the ups and downs of life like everybody else, becomes really easy to tell yourself a story like, and it's sort of like, it almost becomes like a hero's journey, a false hero's journey, which is I'll kind of go off and fix whatever's broken in me so that I get to keep the love that's here. Because if they were to see what I really am, who I can be, who I've been, maybe there will be no love. And so it's really easy. And you can see that the human spirit is mostly seeking love. And that's why the New Testament is, specifically the book of John, is so useful for people, because it allows us to feel these depths of love I don't think we've realized that we're actually seeking. And most of us harden our hearts to it. And so that isolation was a protection mechanism for me to harden my heart so that there was no potential to be hurt. But, even when Christ is teaching people about community, it's not that people in the community aren't going to hurt you and you're not going to hurt them. And that's why forgiveness and repentance and, discernment are such useful things to craft. Because when you set an expectation of somebody else, all you're doing is starting a future resent with them. Because people are fallible, they're going to let us down, right? And we put so much faith in idolatry in people, especially in today's culture. And that's why people get so emotionally crushed, and then they have to isolate. And people will isolate for a variety of different reasons. And, I'm privy to that because I've worked with so many people, but specifically that's why I tend to isolate. And so as an example, going through a hard time recently in some of my life, it's really easy for me to wake up and not want to go to church on Sunday, which in the high moments of the last, couple years of my life, it's the opposite. I'm really drawn to going. I naturally want to go, but I've noticed myself in the last 6 weeks going through a little bit of a valley season where it's really easy for the story and the internal, the enemy to come into my mind and say, well, you're not feeling the best. And do you really want to go around those people and ruin their day too with your energy? And, it's really easy for me to take on those stories and that identity. And so again, I will isolate, not because I'm trying to take myself away from someone as punishment, but in fact, the opposite.
Thank you for opening up and sharing about that. I know a lot of people feel that because I personally feel that often whenever we're feeling down. And that's funny you say the last 6 weeks because I've been feeling that too. And I'm very spiritual, so I wonder if there was something energetic going on there or just winter cold. But it is easy to have that thought that, oh, I don't want to reveal this like darker side of me, or maybe this like side of me that's feeling down lately. And I don't want to like burden them with that. But I think the connections that are true, genuine connections are ones that you can be vulnerable and open up to and like share how you're feeling. And when you do get vulnerable and share how you're really feeling and connect on that deeper level rather than just putting on this front, those are the connections that I think truly fulfill us and the ones that are meaningful. And the best ones are the ones that will love and support you through that and regardless of that, and perhaps even reciprocate and say, you're not alone. I feel that way too. And it's a huge reason I started the podcast. And so I think that's really, really important to highlight. As much as we don't want to perhaps incorporate connection and community into our lives during those seasons, it is important to still incorporate them in.
Yeah, and I think that you asked earlier about happiness. And when we're in our own minds seeking happiness, then the brain is only trying to find the things that are making you happy. And so if you're very anxious and isolated, and that's your tendencies, if you go into a conversation, people, places, things, areas that make you uncomfortable, try and think how you can serve and make everyone else comfortable. Because the worst thing for your isolation anxiety is going to be thinking about how you are particularly feeling. And if you focus on how you're particularly feeling, it's not likely you'll act out the right choices that are going to be beneficial for your future.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. No matter how we're feeling, there's always a way that we can contribute. And I think even in contributing in those small ways, it starts to pull us out of those states of anxiety or maybe sadness?
Right. I spent the day yesterday with someone. His father is still a pastor at 92 years old with a church he planted.
Wow.
And he's been in ministry for 60 years. And, I'm just getting to know him, but I spent the afternoon with him. I showed him around some of my businesses, and he used to do a radio talk show. So he's interested in podcasting. And so I showed him the podcast studio. And his wife has some pretty serious ALS. And in this dark season, I'm trying to get emotional talking about this. In this darker valley season that I've been in, it was so useful for me to be able to pour into him and say, like, how are you doing? And how is your wife doing? Because I know you guys are going through this hard time, and it really wakes you up to the fact that despite my struggles, I'm actually very blessed.
Absolutely. Gaining perspective and hearing what other people are going through often can just immediately not diminish what you're feeling or say that you shouldn't be feeling that way, but just offer perspective as to, wow, I have so much I should really focus on that I am grateful for. And connecting with other people is a great way to do that, to hear their story and understand and have compassion for their feelings and what they're going through.
Right. And that perspective felt like a drink of water that my spirit really needed. And you could see that as someone I really respect as a spiritual father. I had this kind of day meeting set a couple weeks prior. Every instinct in my body was thinking about reaching out to him in the days leading up to it and saying, like, hey, maybe we should reschedule. Yeah. And because I fought that instinct, I think I was able to be of use and service and utility and love to this person who's going through a very difficult time. But not only, I call it selflessness. Not only did I get to be that for him, I also got to have this perspective shift, which also helped me with the valley season. So you can see, if I would have isolated, I would have removed that from him, and then I would have removed that from me. And that's why I think there's such a moral responsibility to becoming and learning to be the versions of our best selves. Because if we hear that and we think, well, yeah, I could, work on myself and become the best version of myself, and I'd make more money and, all these things, and I would have these relationships, or I'd have these things. That's a very individualistic, self-serving aim at why you should become your best. I look at it as more of like a civil community and faith-based responsibility for these reasons.
I absolutely love that. Selflessness. It's also a tongue twister.
It is.
But I truly needed to hear that. Thank you for sharing that. And I know so many others needed to hear that as well. And I think that's such a beautiful, beautiful place to end our conversation. Dylan, thank you so much for taking the time today. And where can everyone find you if they want more of you?
Sure. So just on Instagram, my name is Dylan Phaneuf. On X, Threads, YouTube, kind of all the same thing. I'm active on most of them. I do a lot of if I'm going to be on a social platform, usually it's probably Instagram. I spend a lot of time writing on Threads as well. And I've done a variety of podcasts, and I have a couple podcasts myself. I have a sort of more fitness, nutrition, mindset-based one called the Trademark Physiques podcast. And then I have the Why Not Us podcast, which is done with a spiritual father of mine, very close friend, and, pastor of 30 years experience. And as what they would call, that's a very interesting podcast, in my opinion. I'm biased because it's mine, but I get to bring my life of hedonism and self-serving and lustful spirit to a place that I get to heal on a podcast by someone who's guiding me in real time. And so it's a very interesting dynamic, because if you listen to the first episode versus the 25th, you can really hear the difference in who I am and who I'm becoming. So it's a powerful project.
Wow, I can't wait to tune in, and I'm going to link all of that in the show notes for everyone listening. Dylan, thanks so much again for an amazing, inspiring conversation.
Thank you for having me.
I have found these helpful in my everyday life. Hope you guys have as well. If you did, please leave a rating or review on the show. Send this to a friend who might enjoy the episode. I love you all. Thank you for showing up for yourselves and continuing to be a part of this community and help grow it for us all to live more fulfilling lives. See you all soon.